Okay, so welcome to Vibe, everyone. We're in Mui Wo, we're on Lantau Island, and we're in Hong Kong. Today's presentation comes from Patrick Dransfield. Basically, I'm going to announce Patrick and give you a quick summary of what he's been up to. We're then going to go into some pre-received interview questions. And then after that, we're going to go for, Patrick will talk about his book and give us a good outline of what's there and read a little bit from the book. And then at the end, we'll take audience questions. So then at that point, I'll come round the room and I'll hold the mic for you while you ask any questions. Okay, so we were going to do the presentation with Alan Youngblood. Alan is a well-known local jazz performer and pianist. He was here for the last presentation. Also, Alan appears on the music of the audio book, which I produced for Patrick around 3 years ago, I think, in Studio 114 and back in Wang Tong. So the music is the background for that. We're going to start off with that, with a video with Alan's music in the background, and it's going to be a soundtrack to The House of Usher. So this will last 50 seconds, and then we'll go into the intros. Okay, so without further ado, Patrick Dransfield is an author and photographer. He holds a master's in Chinese history, politics and anthropology from SOAS University of London and majored in English and history of art at Leeds University. He is also the author of The Inner Circle, Wuxing Book 1, Jewel of the Sorcerers, available as an audiobook, and also Book of Photography, Track of Time, Moments of Transition. A sometime resident of South Lantau, Patrick's experience of living and working as both a teacher and a photographer in China from 1985 until 1986 was transformative to set him on a mission to understand how humans and human ideas have migrated across all humanity over time and to connect sages, talented and virtuous people together across the world. Patrick currently lives in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So, Patrick Dransfield, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I was going to say how good that music is. I did hunt Alan down in Wan Chai to persuade him to actually do some music for me for the first book. I didn't quite know what to expect, but I let him listen to some Takamatsu, who's a very famous Japanese composer from the 70s. And actually, he's a really great composer. And he did music to something called Kwaidan. And Alan really, I thought, did a fantastic job coming out with some very airy music there. So anyway, so over to you, yep. Gary.
Okay, so we're going to start with sort of 5 pre-arranged questions that we've had via Facebook. The first question is, at the beginning of book 2, of which Patrick is presenting today, you quote James Joyce, "The imagination is memory." Why is that, Patrick?
Okay, so Joyce's Ulysses is a recreation of a day in the city of Dublin, which is June the 16th, 1904. He wrote the book whilst he was in Trieste, and it is a actual masterpiece of imagination and memory. So memory and imagination are what fuels that particular book. And when I was thinking about book 2, I was going to be in I am in northern Song Dynasty China in the 11th century, and that was my in. If I thought, well, I can imagine it to be like my childhood, and my father, who's similar to the central protagonist, who's called Tianyong in this instance. Tianyong was a brilliant man. He was a scientist. He was a beekeeper. He was a winemaker. He was a bon vivant. He had a circle of friends that would, entertain him, and he'd entertain them with poems. Okay. My dad actually played the mouth organ. He wasn't a poet as such, but he had this bunch of guys who'd survived the Second World War, and had slightly hedonistic views, I think, really. Okay. And that was my Luoyang, the recreation of the 12 immortals of Luoyang. So that's how I managed to get into the story and into the framing of it.
Okay, so that was book 2. In one of the several epilogues in book 1, The Inner Circle, Wuxing, Jewel of the Sorcerers, you make reference to the artist, the late Dame Paula Rigo, who she says that art is bloodless revenge. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Oh, okay. So, well, I'm not there yet, actually. I think Anthol Fugar said that the only emotion I sit with when I write is love, but I'm not there yet by any means. So book 1 has one character who's an amalgam of former business associates, villains actually, and basically it amuses me to think of them poring over the book, trying to find themselves, which they won't, and they won't pore over the book either. But it's bloodless revenge there. Book 2 has a couple of characters in the imperial court of Dongjing, drawn from some rather vicious folk that I met whilst in Dubai. And book 3 will, when I get to it, include a rather complacent and entitled character drawn from life, who in this iteration is head eunuch of the first court. Now, this is drawing from the Joyce tradition, because Buck Mulligan, who's a kind of gossip and nemesis to Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses, was based on a guy called Oliver St. John Gogarthy. Okay, so it's a real guy. And actually, Gogarthy had a good sense of humour. He said that he was an accessory before the fact of Joyce's more famous Mulligan. A quick word on the novel form, if I may. The late Martin Amis, in his autobiography, Inside Story, said that the novel was the most exposing, and therefore, I guess, probably the most honest of writing disciplines. And I kind of imagine, I think the way that I wove book 2 especially, was like being a witness on the stand, and you have to kind of make up a story. A bit like, what was that character called? Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects, who makes the whole movie up from the bulletin board behind him, or in front of him. That's what a novel is. It's different from poetry, it's different from essays. You are quite exposed. And just to round out that idea is that one of the themes in the Inner Circle series is the idea of building an inner circle of people that you can trust around yourself. And I hope that my children would learn perhaps something from that, to make sure you're actually surrounding yourself with people who are going to be helpful to you in your life rather than others. They haven't read it, of course, so that's still out there. But and also, please don't underestimate the power of rejection. Having an outlet, which is bloodless, is much better, because I'm thinking about Donald Trump and President Obama, April 2016, when Obama publicly humiliated Trump in the White House during a kind of press party. I think a lot of the things that are happening now are as a consequence of that. And also, if a certain Mr. Adolf Hitler had actually got into art school, might have been a different result.
But probably not.
Okay, maybe not.
Okay, so the third question is, the first book is dedicated to your mother. The second book is dedicated to your father. And you are about to co-publish another novel with your eldest brother, Graham. Does literature, and specifically novel writing, run in the Dransfield family?
My first novel is dedicated to my late mother, Pauline. She would have insisted on that anyway. She had an almost spiritual reverence for poets, especially, and she extended that passion to me, and particularly with fiction. Book 2 is dedicated to my father, Philip. It's actually the scene, he's passed away as well, but it's a centenary of his birth this year, 2025. Actually, the principal characters in the book are Tian Yong and his second son, Tian Po. And they're based on historical figures, Xiao Yong and his second son, Xiao Po. Xiao Yong, like my father, was a very brilliant man, a poet, a sage, a scientist, and a discoverer of something called the Before Heaven sequence of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, or Book of Changes. He, being an exceptional man, described himself, he was not immodest, he described himself as one of 100 million others, exceptional beyond 100 million others, but he could practice Wu Wei, which is doing nothing against nature. Okay. In the book, actually Xiao Po is his son, and we only know anything about Xiao Po because he wrote a eulogy for his father when his father had passed. But I'm reimagining myself in a way as being a little bit like Xiao Po, and in this case Tian Po, following the benign shadow of a very brilliant man. But I have to practice, and Tian Po in the book has to practice Yu Wei, or self-cultivation. And in my fictionalized account, both these characters can what we call time surf. They're able to move their minds into particular black spots in the future to try and harmonize earth to heaven. Now, Tian Yong, because he's a very brilliant person, can just do that with his will. Tian Po has to go through a kind of apprenticeship where he becomes an artist, and therefore is able to move through the paintings he produces. And actually I'm thinking now of Chloe Fang, who the first time I ever did a book launch here was for the photography book, and she walked in with a big clatter about now, and that was the first time I met her. And she actually did the cover of this book, and it's based on a portrait she did of herself, which is in itself based on a picture from the 18th century. And obviously that is the faint painting that Tian Po created in the book. Talking about my brothers very briefly,
Yep.
Thank you for asking that. My middle brother, Johnny, has authored a teen fiction novel called The Other Ones, and he owns a Morocco-bound, which is a beer and bookshop in Bermondsey, South London. Graham is my eldest brother, and we've co-written a book. I've been his lackey, and he's been the main protagonist. And it's actually an auto-fiction series of books. And it's going to be published next month, and it's called Trout Fishing on the Tees, Me and Tony Blair. On dark days, I reflect that we three brothers are kind of like the mirror triplets of the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. They were genuinely born in Yorkshire. We sadly were not. Our parents blamed us for that. Not sure how. They were generally born there. They proved to be incredibly popular both in their time and to this day continuing. And we, well, who can say? We have a crowd here, so that's good. They were all amazingly gifted and talented. And I guess the jury is out on that one for me and my two brothers.
Okay. All right. If there was a universal theme that plays out in book 1 and 2, that was a series, what would that be?
Okay. Well, I think I've talked quite a lot about an inner circle of people, so that's definitely a theme. And the other is the cyclical nature of time. Okay. The Chinese, through the I Ching, definitely have this idea of the cyclical nature of time. And fairly recently I've been looking into Aztec concepts of time. Okay. So there would be a couple of examples. The 6 guardians in the book, there are 6 guardians. There's the 5, they're characterized and they change in each book because they're kind of reincarnated. But you have fire, water, earth, metal and wood as elemental characters in the book. We'll find more as we go forward. And then there's a 6th who's the sort of central guardian, the master guardian. Basically I began my research into all of this in February 2020. And it's taken me into the rabbit hole of the Before Heaven sequence of the I Ching. The 64 hexagrams, the historical Shaoyang, put into a binary sequence. So in the 11th century, these 64 have been kind of, I think you probably know what the hexagrams are. They're yang and yin lines, and you can have 64 of them in different iterations if there's three hexagrams. He worked out how you can actually look at human history through this progression from the yang lines to the yin lines over 64 iterations. And so he came up with the idea that there was at least 300,000 years in an epoch.
Right.
Okay? And human history goes from an epoch. And so he'd say in the Yang period, which is where you have a sage guardian, a sage emperor, everything is benign, everybody's having a great time, all is calm. And then it deteriorates to a yin time. And what he had to say about, if you know this, when you're in a yin time, then your ruler will be vain, immoral, self-admiring, vicious, petty, cruel, and tyrannical. I wonder who he's talking about. Another hobby horse of mine is how human beings, and especially academics, are particularly guilty of this, never attribute their sources to either people or actually particularly, definitely to older cultures. So the Sung Dynasty China actually lent the Western Renaissance an awful lot, never attributed, and also Aztec culture, which I've recently found out about. And in my own book, in the book, I actually kind of introduce the idea that perhaps the historical Shaoyang was inspired by the Kabbalah, because in the 11th century, Jewish settlers were first coming to China, and no doubt the timing is about right, because the Kabbalah as a discipline, as a source, was beginning to be invented at that time. That's pure conjecture on my part. It's just
fair enough. All right, so last question before we go into what is the book about. What's next? What have you got lined up?
Well, I guess when you get to my age, it's all a bit ad hoc. But I'm reflecting actually that I was very lucky from February 2020 to about November 2020, where are we, 25 now, 24.
Yeah.
I did have gaps in between, so I was able to do the photography book, I was able to do book 1, I was able to research book 2. So my hope is that basically I'll get some time, because Abu Dhabi's become quite busy, which is good, but I want to get into book 3. And that's going to take place in the Forbidden City, 17th century, the Jesuit mission to the Forbidden City, and their transmissions back to people like Leibniz and people like that in Europe during the 1670s. Unfortunately, the people I've recently been researching have all got the names of cocktails. So there's Martini and another guy, so that's going to make people think it's not necessarily credible, but there we go. Caramel is the other guy.
Caramel.
Okay. Great.
Okay, well, thanks for answering those questions, Patrick. We're now going to go into the section where you introduce the book and I believe do a reading from it.
Great. Okay, fantastic.
Okay,
and then I think we've got a couple of questions online that have come in, and then we'll go to a Q&A here. So, in book 1 of the Inner Circle Wuxing, Jewel of the Sorcerers, the main protagonist, Paul Tien Commode, is set on a quest by, among others, Winston Churchill from Liverpool to war and revolution-torn Petrograd in 1917, only to face his nemesis, Gregory Gurdjieff, on April 17th, 1917. In Book 2, Sima Qian's Bright Mirror, we travel back 880 years to the time we now know as of the Northern Sung, and we're introduced to the sage and I Ching divination master, Tian Yong. Tian Yong had predicted through the circular nature of time, as captured in the before heaven sequence of the I Ching, both the likely dark fate of Paul Tien Commode and of human history from 1917 to August 6, 1945. I've chosen to read from Book 2 an extract from The May Queen, Chapter 4 of Part 1, Spring, Tian Yong's Wild Years. Tian Yong, a young man of around 25 at this point, has been befriended by Reb Yenkel, aka Ai Wen, a Persian Jew who's come to China to trade and also to introduce the mysteries of the Kabbalah. Ai Wen has a pet dormouse he calls Lemurge, who he talks to constantly. It can be quite lonely being a wanderer along the open road. During this chapter, Tianyong is introduced to the ancient shaman rituals of the Tui indigenous people in Qinghai, which predate the more prosaic city Confucian ones, as performed simultaneously by the Emperor Zhenzong in the capital Dongjing, many thousands of miles away. And also, Wen's ancient book of Kabbalic spells goes missing, a theft that brings about huge calamity over 800 years later. I'm just going to get a sip of water. So here we are. So this is chapter 4, The May Queen. She was a beautiful young woman. Her bare shoulders were shivering from the cold. Tianyong gallantly draped his cape over her shoulders and put his arms around her to help stop her teeth from chattering. "These people are barbaric," Wen muttered. The full moon of the spring solstice brought pale blue illumination to the Konakur Lake in Qinghai province, but its light was incapable of penetrating the inky blackness to the east that indicated the steep mountain drop that the village retinue, including Tian and Wen, had ascended to reach the plateau that the lake had formed. The glow of the red embers of the pyres, set alight by the various Tui villagers, could be seen in the valley below, ruby red counterpoints in the darkness along the shore of the vast salt lake. The faint but heady smell of hemp smoke drifted across, occasionally stronger as the breeze shifted. A small figure silhouetted against the star-spangled sky appeared on top of the outcrop of granite rock and marked the descent down into the valley below. The clear blue moon-illuminated air showed the feathers of the shaman's cloak in vivid detail, and the tip of his mask beak could be plainly seen as he twisted his head right and left, scanning the landscape. Even from this distance, and presumably considering himself unobserved, the Tin Hau village shaman kept in character, his one-legged movements still very much the jerky dance steps of a senior male crane. Wen nodded his head towards the shaman and whispered, "He's looking out for her, to finish her off, if she survived that fall." The effects of the mushroom stew, the music, dancing, and hemp smoke were still grasping his brain, Tien observed. It was both interesting and alarming. For the first time, he was conscious of present time and the process of his mind as it darted like a minnow from thought to unconnected thought. He realized that his mind was always like that, never setting on one thing, but the combined effect of the drugs and the elevated pilot of his mind was able to observe the passing of time, second by eternal second. It was not a comfortable state of mind to be in, and he'd hate to be in this state permanently, in the grip of such powerful mind-bending drugs. But part of his mind realized that this was an important path to the realization that there were gates which opened within the mind to different levels of consciousness. His father would have disapproved of the method, but approved of the result, he thought. But now was not the time for such musings, as Wen pushed him and the girl further into the shadows to avoid the Argus-like vigil of the shaman and his gang of crazed village thugs. The previous afternoon, had started pleasantly enough. It was a festival of the May Queen at the zenith of the yang time of the year cycle, and so the agrarian tradition of the Tui people dictated that a little yin ceremonial blood needed to be shed to ensure a good millet harvest. The same rite and divination was being performed across the country, and the Emperor Zhenzong in Dongjing would be seen in public wearing red clothes and participating in similar rituals. But Wen and Tianyong had wandered far off the civilized map and were now at the very borderland between the civilized and the nomadic, the very borders of China itself as to the north of them, and the narrow paths ascended to Tubu, the land of the snows, the mountains of the Himalayas. The land and climate were harsh, and much of the thin topsoil was rendered useless for cultivation on account of its excessive salt content. The salt lake was so vast as to seem like an endless sea, and legend had it that the Konakur Lake joined the mythical Western Sea at its outer, mist-obscured limits. Dunes of pink salt surrounded Tianyong and Wen on their right hand. These salt dunes brought huge prosperity to the Han salt merchants, who had the approval from the emperor to export this vital commodity. Such merchants were an aristocratic class, comprised the top families among the Han settlers. They, of course, were rarely to be seen in such a barbaric place. Theirs were the fortified vast estates, housing scores of wives and concubines in the lush lower valleys and plains below. After centuries of rubbing shoulders with their Han cousins, the Tuis now followed the core Chinese beliefs relating to heaven and earth, the seasons, yin and yang, but with some more ancient twists, as became evident as the rites progressed into the late evening and night of the previous day. The May Queen was now warming up, and her limpid eyes glistened doe-like and appealingly to Tian Yong, who was not unaware of her rather voluptuous nakedness. He recalled the beginning of the ceremony surrounding the yin rites. The girl, certainly one of the village beauties, but not from one of the more prominent families, was beautifully clothed, carried like a queen on a scholar's chair, her long black hair slightly coiled and festooned with columbines and bluebells. Smiling and throwing flowers from a basket on her lap, she was evidently enjoying the attention and the interruption from the constant grind of subsistence living. She was around 16, and already the marks of hard work were beginning to mark her body. Her hands were more like shovels than the graceful, delicate hands of a true yin princess. There was a festive atmosphere surrounding the procession that snaked its way as a train of firstly young men at the front, 3 of whom struggled to bring up a large male goat, who seemed to have already got the limitation that this was to be his last day on earth. Then, the elder women trailing at the back, climbing carefully in their hemp-heeled sandals up the narrow ascending rock path. In front of the girl was a village shaman, already dressed up and in character as a crane spirit, his crown of feathers, cape of feathers, and large yellow beak mask convincingly disguising the Da Liu village elder. His 9-year-old son, Xiao Liu, accompanied him, a sharp-shouldered little boy with cruel eyes and a mulberry-coloured birthmark on the right side of his face, which seemed to have motivated a rather vindictive nature in the boy. Ai Wen, again referring to his goatskin book of spells and mysteries, had delivered a speech in the village that morning, and his knowledge of the origins of time and his fine singing voice had reached the ears of the village elder. That and his imperial letter convinced village elder Da Liu that it was fortune's call that such a curious stranger had descended on them on the morning of the spring equinox. The older women trailed behind at the back of the train, chanting happily and supervising the young women, who carried large hampers of food and the large earthenware cauldrons and cooking pots for the coming village feast. Qian was among the young men, and he, like them, could not help but cast a furtive glance at the beautiful woman, Little Red, and her slim, naked ankles, exposed through the chair legs of the scholar chair, and this served as her palanquin. The village elder's minion, a small, nervous man, had been repeating that Ai Wen and Tian had been invited through Ai Wen's impressive imperial letter, signed and sealed by the Emperor Zhenzong, no less, and it was outlined to them in no uncertain terms that this was indeed an honour for outsiders to be invited to the yin ceremony. But they were observers only. Partaking of the food and wine and joining in the dancing was all fine and good, but no hanky-panky with the local girls, and definitely no interference with the shaman rites initiated by the elder as the crane shaman. Ai Wen asked if he and Lemerge could perform some music to accompany the dancing, glancing towards his magnificent moon lute, and after a few seconds the beady eyes of the shaman took in both Tian and Ai Wen and then nodded his assent. Tian considered there was something rather bird-like, fanatical and inhuman about Da Liu's black eyes even at that point, as though the character of the crane bird was already taking hold of his human brain. The pitiful goat bleated as the column broke above the mountain path, and the land gave way to a vast plateau where the huge Qinghai Lake glittered in the evening sunlight. Pale dunes of salt surreally ascended on the west side like vast dunes. An outcrop of granite arose like a tower 100 feet above the lake, providing a suitable elevation point for the May Queen to be lifted to survey her kingdom of the day. Pyres of smoked hemp and roots were set aflame beneath the cauldrons. The male goat was unceremoniously slaughtered, and its skin flayed and the guts and meat efficiently dissected, the choicest pieces being thrown into the cauldrons, along with various herbs and piles of dried mushrooms. Around an hour or so later, Tian took a bowl of the soup from a smiling local girl and sniffed approvingly. The tenderest pieces of the goat combined with the earthly favours of the mushrooms in a delicious manner. "Be careful with that brew, young Master Tian," Ai Wen warned. "Why? It's delicious," Tian gasped as he drowned his bowl. "The last time I was offered a bowl of soup from the Tui on Yin Day, I was as high as a kite for 3 whole days," Ai Wen explained. "High as a what?" Tian asked, gulping down another bowl, quite sure that the young lady had winked at him. "Well, after drinking that lot, you will definitely know what I mean by high as a kite for yourself. High as a kite for yourself." The area immediately below the rock escarpment was a traditional area for the village to join the shaman in his hypnotic dance. On his tunic were sewn numerous talismanic iron figurines moulded from the core of meteorites, and they jangled to his swaying dance. His young son proved to be quite a hard taskmaster, and it was he who, holding a whip for the purpose, corralled 12 teenage village children to run around the circular fire. The shaman's dance heralded a time past where there were numerous deities on the earth that shone like lustre and evil ghosts that buzzed like flies. A time when all things, men, animals, plants and rocks, all things animate and inanimate, had speech and were kame. The shaman's chant came from this older world, and as he requested that the spirit of the crane enter him temporarily and succeed his happier first soul and mingle with his second soul, the more primeval soul of the living breath. "Arise now, show yourself, even to your slender waist. Drive, drive like a crane, rise. Drive, drive, open the way. Kakak, 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 sitting, string, peck, peck, check, check, check." A white-boned turtle shell was placed carefully in the blue-framed hotness of the fire. A divination about the coming year's crop was about to be determined. Was it going to be a good year? Ai Wen and Lemurch were invited to sit on a chair in the centre, and as the sun set in the west and the full moon began to ascend, Ai Wen performed an ecstatic blur of ascending notes from his moon-shaped lute. His concentration and performance indicated that he too had partaken of the soup and was at one with the heady smell of the burning hemp leaves and the gyrating dancing of the assembled villagers around the large fire. Ai Wen would have been well advised to listen to his own advice, for little Yu had taken the opportunity of the village and Ai Wen's collective distraction to extract a large book of spells from Ai Wen's Hessian bag and hide it under his own tunic. As it was at this moment that Lemurch disappeared, it is rumoured that little Yu dispatched the small dormouse at the time of the theft, but only little Yu will know if that were true. The frenetic dance was led by the shaman, now totally possessed by the spirit of a crane. He performed with one leg only, his feathers bristling and wings spreading in a perfect imitation of a dancing male crane. As the pace of the dance rose to a crescendo, the shaman pulled out from the centre of the fire with his special staff, the plastron. What is happening?" asked Tian. "The shaman is breaking the turtle bone with his stick to see where it cracks," the young soup lady explained. "There are 64 hexagrams scratched into the bone. 63 of them are not disastrous, but if he determines that the 29th one, water over water, is the cracked hexagram, then... But not to worry, that one has not come up for centuries." At that moment, the shaman gave out an anguished cry. Khan the deep had been summoned, deep above and deep below, meaning pitfalls and almost certainly a bad harvest. Suddenly, the whole mood of the assembled villagers had changed. "We are in uncharted territory. The old Yin ceremony must insist on a blood sacrifice, and let's hope it is to be perpetuated on the female goat over there," whispered Ai Wen. The young serving girl withdrew, and the implication was certain that having outside people involved in the Yin rituals had angered heaven. Angry eyes rested on Ai Wen and Tian Yong, as well as the crane shaman, who had, after all, invited them to attend. Sensing the mood of the gathering, the old crane raised his right arm and pointed towards the girl. An old woman at the rear gasped as three youths grabbed the girl from her throne and carried her up towards the top of the rock escarpment. She seemed to be unaware and drugged as they scattered her clothes and threw them back to the villagers below. For a brief moment, the young woman's naked body was silhouetted by the full moon, and then she was thrown from a promontory into the lake below. Tian's mind was scrambled, and sharp sticks and grasping hands moved towards him. The last thing he remembered was Ai Wen's concerned face close to his own. Then he passed out.
Excellent, thanks very much, very enthralling. So we're going to move on now to a couple of questions that we've received on Facebook, and then I'm going to ask if anybody's got any questions from what you've heard so far on books 1 and 2. So you seem naturally attracted to different cultures, Patrick. Are there any cultures, ancient or modern, that interest you?
Well, actually, I've just gone down this rabbit hole recently, which I kind of referred to earlier. Oh, sorry. Which is ancient Aztec culture. Now, when I was doing research in the I Ching and looking for the parallel of the binary system to what Leibniz was actually researching as well in the Western Renaissance, I really thought that the kind of yin, the yang to yin, was actually the kind of origins of that. But actually it wasn't. It's actually the ancient Aztec culture of time.
Okay.
So there was a period in Mexican culture where the priests were in charge, and they determined 3 types of time, actually. One set, which is based on 20, which is the hands and the feet, means that was the kind of days of the week. And then they followed Saturn rather than the lunar calendar for a longer calendar. And then actually on the Aztec monuments, there are references to long time where they calculated down to around somewhere like 40 million years.
Okay.
And what that meant was that they were able to tell you 40 million years ago on April the 7th, it was a Tuesday.
Very good. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for that. One last question before we open it up to the audience. Your first book has been likened to Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, a journey through physical space. Your new book takes on a journey through time, reminiscent of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which also covers generations of a family and characters whose lives and identities echo across time. What are your main literary influences?
Good Lord. Well, those are hard people to to come up with. Sean Yates sent these questions in, and he very kindly actually also sub-edited the book. And so I was reading 100 Years of Solitude actually when I was in Beijing in 1985, 1986. And it's one of the few books where I actually finished it and then had to read the last 30 pages again, because it just, the whole book comes into relief at that very last moment, and it's extraordinary. As a feat of imagination again, I mean, just a fantastic book. I think for book 2, as opposed to book 1, The First Inner Circle, Hilary Mantel has been quite an inspiration for me.
Okay.
Because I think for book 1, if I was to be really honest, I think I was showing off a bit with the history, or probably a bit insecure about the history maybe, so putting lots of indexes and stuff like that. And I learned from Mantel that she was putting what she called the flesh on the bones of the ancients, and she does it so brilliantly. And so I was reading quite a lot of her, and I can't say that mine is anywhere close, but at least in book 2 I was trying to make Tian Yong and his characters human, and I think that's where my dad's kind of voice was as well, his inspiration as well.
Okay. All right, so that's all the questions we've had preloaded. Can I throw it open to the audience? Questions, Edith? I'll hold it for you.
Okay. I was just curious about your descriptions of the clothing of the shaman and this sort of scene at the Qinghai Lake. Did you, with regard to the clothing of the shaman, did you research that?
Oh yeah, hopefully I've researched most of the details in the book one way or another. And I also studied anthropology, Chinese anthropology, which was on kind of funereal worship. But I got very much into shamanism and stuff like that. I think that's also a throwback to my time at university when I was about 20, 21, reading Don Juan and all this kind of weird 60s stuff. But yeah, to answer your question, Edith, that even that poem is the kind of shaman exclamation is a kind of ecstatic shout. The guy who's becoming, the crane, shouts at a particular point in the ritual. And I've managed to get myself as a visiting scholar in Abu Dhabi, so most of my weekends are spent in the library there. And I came across books in the 50s which were from Qinghai, and the Tui ethnic group is a real one. There were descriptions of these types of services, etc. To go to the cloves, particularly in Tibet, where I guess metal is quite difficult to source because you're in the mountains, they do have metal, and you might have seen them. They have fake ones, but also the real ones are small kind of figures. They could be Buddhas, or they could be other type of shamanic kind of figures, but they're made out of iron, and they are actually from meteorites, because that was the one source of metal.
Yeah, that was one detail that really leapt out at me, and quite interesting. Also, the costume with the bird's beak is very reminiscent of Northwest American Hakut and other tribes that have also a forms of shamanism.
I think it's a universal thing from ancient cultures, because you have the same in China, you have same to some degree in Japan as well, and the same kind of rituals, etc. So I think we're tapping into something towns, pre-cities and all of that. And, so the idea of the first soul and the second soul is also this ancient idea of animism. I think one of the big differences between Chinese culture and if you like, Western culture, is that we have, not all of us, but we have the idea of a deity on top, and then human beings are made from God and part of God, and then you have animals. With the older Chinese beliefs, we are all stuff. Humans are stuff. The other multiple things that come out of yin and yang are stuff. So we might think we're special, but we're still stuff like the other 100,000 things. Not sure where that quite fits into shamanism, but it is part of ancient Chinese culture. And in fact, actually, you could argue, and I think people do, that the emperor, and I kind of make that parallel, that he's actually ploughing the agrarian soil and he's doing these various things. He was a shaman. That is, the ritual and rites were essential to a good harvest and to the healthy and tranquility of the empire.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Any other questions from the audience?
Jonathan, lovely to see you.
Okay, Patrick, not having read your first book and listening to
He
this,
didn't. No, you heard everything.
I produced it. For audio.
I still have no idea what either of the books are about. And what's it got to do with Sima Qian?
Well, Sima Qian, you'll have to read the book. There you are, there's a copy over there. Sima Qian, as you know, or Sima Qian, as you correctly pronounce it, was a 2nd century BC historian, the grand historian. That's a good question, actually, because his mirror is in the book, so you'd have to read the book as to find out what that mirror signifies, etc. But another underlying theme that I think I find important is the idea of sages or historians, and particularly historians. As you know, Sima Qian called out the Qin emperor and called him a black force in China. He was the chap who did build the first Great Wall, buried the scholars, and unified China. But what we know about that first, if you like, Chinese China emperor is through Sima Qian. And so the idea of voices through history, recording the activities of those in power, I find very, very powerful. And it happens to this day. I mean, we know a lot more about the Cultural Revolution because people risked their lives to make recordings and quite potentially hide them. But that's a tradition in China which goes on and on. So those silent voices recording is why Sima Qian is honored in the book.
Okay, so short answer, buy the book. Okay, so anyone else have any questions for Patrick today? Okay, hang on just a second.
With your time now in the Emirates, have you seen any parallels with the interest in time? It's a very distinct culture, and I'm conscious that you've been deeply investigating and researching your current writing. I'm wondering if you're seeding ideas for a further book on a different topic.
Oh, well, it'll be the same. I hope to get 5 of these out because there's so great question. 3 things. I'll try and remember all 3. The first thing is at the Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, and my former boss, Mohammed Al-Suwaidi, pointed this out to me. There are 99 names of Allah written. And he said to me, the third one, the final one, 100th, is blank because we cannot describe Allah, we cannot describe the eternal. And you find that parallel, you know, in all Chinese culture and every culture, I think, to some degree. So that's one question. The other is about Sudanese people, because I've got some great friends who are from Sudan, which I've made, and researching all. So they basically, when the British left, Abu Dhabi specifically, that it was a colony. Of course, it was part of the British Empire, and I think it was Harold Wilson's government that said, "Okay, well, we're leaving," and the sheikh said, well, actually, we could really do with some help. He said, well, go to the Sudanese because they've been actually educated as mandarins by us. So they form a very important backdrop to Abu Dhabi's success, I think. And I think actually reading all of this about different types of time, Sudanese time is quite different because, not today, this is going back in time, but basically we have this idea of time starting and going on eternally. I think that's our kind of idea of progress in, if you like, the West, inverted commas. What I got excited about with the Chinese is the secular nature of time, and it all stops and it starts again. With the Mayan, this concept that you can actually trace to 4 million, there's always a starting point, and nobody quite knows what that starting point is, but this amazing concept of time, which is totally different and changed the way Western Renaissance considered time. And then Sudanese time is totally different again because you're herding goats in traditional, that type of place. And so to say, I think it goes round like this. The river, I'm crossing the river, so it must be this time. I'm going to the mosque, so it must be this day. So the activity comes before the time, which makes an awful lot of sense if you're actually dependent on the cycles of nature, which are not always precise. So what I found, I didn't know anything about calendars until I started coming into Vibe, and you had that gentleman who was a warlock or whatever, and he, I thought calendars were, what they were. I never thought there could be any discussion about a calendar. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the room? Well, one last question.
Can you explain how you got to writing novels and how, in that itinerary between 1985 to 1986 and the present?
Okay. I studied English literature, and also history of art. So I guess there was something that I always wanted to express in writing. I avoided becoming a journalist. I know you're a journalist, but Jim Pringle was my boss in Beijing in the 80s. So to go to 1986, and he was with Newsweek, and I was kind of like his researcher. To be honest, it was the best job I ever had because I was paid US dollars and asked to read the China Post, the China Daily. So that was a fabulous job. But I was put off journalism by Newsweek, to be frank, because I saw what Jim wrote, and I saw what came out the other end. So I know there's different types of journalism, but that was what my introduction to it was. So I thought it was far more honest to become a salesman, actually, than write for Newsweek, at least, anyway. But I guess the impetus to write a novel was during COVID, February, just before COVID, you know, in March swept across the world. In February 2020, I left Hong Kong to spend some time in London, not terribly welcome. So I spent most of my time in SOAS Library, and I started reading Greek history. And I thought, well, who is the equivalent of Thucydides? I'm probably mispronouncing it, but who is the equivalent of the historian who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars in Chinese history? And I'd not heard of Sima Qian at that point, but then I discovered him. And I kind of wanted to give voice to people who are not always heard. So I think that's what, to some degree, is the stimulus to the novel as well.
Sima Qian's well known in China.
Huh?
Sima Qian's well known in China.
Yeah, I'm a very ignorant person. I had never heard of him. I'd only studied a kind of 18th, 19th century history, so the earlier stuff I had no clue of until I actually started doing the research.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Patrick. Very enthralling talk. And Patrick is here today, obviously, to promote his book, Sima Qian's Bright Mirror, which is for sale. It's his second book in the series. I don't think we've got any first ones in the series for sale, do we? Or
We have the audio book of the first one.
so the audio book is that, and it's also on.
And we have a special
Amazon.
package. We have a special package where if you buy the novel, you can also get, this isn't a hard cover, so you're not going to get this one, but you're going to get the photo book and also a copy of the audio book, all for 500 Hong Kong dollars. There you go.
Okay, brilliant. All right, well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Patrick, for coming along today, and a very enthralling presentation.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much, and thank you all for coming.